Well, a very good evening. That was the inimitable Sugar Hill Gang and Rapper's Delight, one of 10 singles chosen by Dylan Jones in his excellent new book, Shiny and New, Moments of Pop Genius That Defined the 80s. I'm Matt D'Ancona. I'm an editor here at Tortoise, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this ThinkIn, in which we'll be asking the simple but testing question: how does pop define the 80s? Why that question? Well, I suppose because there has been often made a claim that the 80s was somehow a rather shallow decade, the decade that taste forgot, people say, musically speaking, a vaguely embarrassing interlude between punk and Britpop, and that what really mattered about that time was stuff like Thatcherism, the Cold War at its end, the rise of the yuppie, the age of Gordon Gekko, and the mantra that greed was good. But one has to ask, does that presentation sell the musical culture of the 80s short? I tend to think so, but let's see where we get with the discussion. As ever, we're longing to find out what you think, and keeping order in the chat tonight is Tortoise's own one-man style council and chief Bananarama expert, Mark St. Andrew. Hi, Mark. So please do chip in and let us know what you're thinking. We have a terrific lineup of speakers tonight. Dylan Jones, who I think is here, in addition to being, there he is. Hi, Dylan. Hi, there you are. We knew you'd find you, Magic Mike. Who, in addition to a truly transformative 2-decade editorship of GQ, I think one of the great editorships of recent decades, has written somehow more than 20 books, including what I certainly regard as the definitive life of Bowie, and he's, amongst many other accomplishments, a board member of the British Fashion Council, and we welcome him. Martyn Ware, known to, I hope, all of you being educated people, as a member of both the Human League and Heaven 17, the latter of which was a project of the hugely influential British Electric Foundation. But he's also a pioneer in 3D music, a podcaster, and a visiting professor at Queen Mary University of London. And to Sarah Champion, multi-talented presenter, DJ, actor of immense experience, and for the purposes of tonight, huge musical knowledge, celebrated for her shows on Absolute Radio, and key to our purposes, an iconic presence on Absolute 80s. So we'll be asking her, what we should really be thinking. Welcome to them all, and welcome to you. Dylan, let's dive straight in. You have written about the 80s before, in the context of Live Aid, and then a hugely successful book recently about the New Romantics. So what were you in this book trying to land? What were you trying to achieve in this particular assessment of that decade?
Well, I actually don't think I'm allowed to write any books that aren't about the 80s. So I had to find another angle. I don't think my agent allows me to write about any other decade. Well, the Live Aid book was about the event itself, told through the prism of the various artists that performed there. And then the book that that was published last year, Sweet Dreams, was about, as you say, it was about the importance of the neo-romantic period and how it came out of punk and disco and sort of sprouted in a way that that allowed a lot of different genres to take hold. And I suppose that this is a direct sequel to that. And like the other books, it's a way to try and redeem the 80s. And I do think that the 80s gets kind of squeezed. And I think you were right in your introduction, that it is still patronized. I think that people see the 80s as very much a sort of reductive period. But what I was trying to do with this book, with this new book, was to show that actually it was the first decade where pop music became atomized and kind of exploded. It became kaleidoscopic. I think pop music up until the 80s was linear. One thing happened, then another thing happened immediately after it. And there were genres, but pretty much in terms of the change in the zeitgeist, it was like dominoes. But as soon as you get to the 80s, things exploded. Things became completely kaleidoscopic. And I think one of the reasons that's happened is because of technology, because technology made it easier for people to make records. It changed the way that records were made. And it encouraged people to make records in a hugely, there were more varietals, I suppose. It became like those multi-pack of cereal packets that you had from the 60s. You have to interrupt me. I'll just keep on talking forever.
No.
By the way, I enjoyed your dancing at the top. Your dancing was spectacular.
There's I'm always looking for alternative irons in the fire, of course. Dancing being one. So let's talk about the book is, it seems to me, a pretty persuasive reprieve for the 80s, and it does so it through. You begin and end with bookend with essays, which I'd like to ask you about next, but specifically about the 10 singles you chose. Now, your formation as a journalist and a writer about these matters was going on in that decade. I mean, your head must have been absolutely buzzing with candidates for those 10. So how did you have a kind of long list, a short list? I mean, or did they actually suggest themselves quite easily? I wasn't remotely surprised that Ghost Town was there, because I know that's a record that means a lot to you. But other ones, how did you get to that list?
Well, they're not meant to be the best records of the 80s, and they're not meant to be the most successful records of the 80s. They're meant to be records which say something about the genre of music which they created or they were part of, or they say something about society. And I think that we start with rap, we end with a different kind of rap. We talk about acid house, we talk about indie, new pop, ska, but also in the way that technology and media allowed personalities to kind of become colossus in their fields, like Madonna, like Prince, and also someone like Bruce Springsteen, who was a child of the 70s in terms of when he became popular. But because of media and because of technology in the 80s, he became almost part and parcel of the decade.
He's so really interesting because he the way we talk about Born in the USA and also Springsteen, the phenomenon, and the 80s it was a process as well as a time, in the sense that it took acts like Bruce Springsteen and it turned them into something else.
Yeah, I think that distribution systems, MTV, drum machines, the way that media exploded and kind of shrank the world in the 80s, are part and parcel of why a lot of these records and a lot of these artists were successful.
And let's talk about Blue Monday in particular, because I think that was one of the standout chapters for me. Why was that single so important?
It was important because it was a confluence of so many different things. You had a band that had in its previous incarnation, Joy Division, had been the sort of the heroes of post-punk, reinventing themselves because of trips to New York, gloomy, quite brittle Mancunians managing to make the most kind of euphoric dance records that completely co-opted New York nightlife. It almost created a genre in itself. and that record is as important as any record by Kraftwerk in the mid 70s, and it's quite an extraordinary thing, and it continues to have a life of its own.
Yes.
It like I say, it's almost its own genre.
Yeah, no, it's a really, and of course you mentioned Kraftwerk, and that of course, you know, Kraftwerk figures in your description of the birth of hip hop. I mean, one thing I wanted to ask Elena was that at the beginning of the book is bookended by, you know, you first talk about, as you say, this fascinating process of atomization, and right. I'm quoting here: pop was no longer a series of logically positioned building blocks, but rather a rapidly developing metropolis, which I think really conjures up what was happening. At the end of the book, you're kind of talking about an opposite tendency, which is the homogenization of music. And you look particularly at Stock Aitken and Waterman, and a number of acts that appeared to sort of converge around, if you like, a kind of blandish but very big high energy. So is there a tension there between the atomization and the homogenization, and does it resolve itself, or do they coexist?
I think they start to coexist because technology makes it easier for lots of people to get involved in this world. And I think by focusing on Stock Aitken and Waterman, I was trying to kind of contextualize them in a way that people are incredibly patronizing about them, which I think is unfair, because they deliberately make kind of records with sloppy beats so that anyone could dance to them. And for many people who were young at the time, those records are as important and as dynamic as in the mid 60s. But yeah, I was trying to show that in all of these different boxes, the way that pop had been atomized, that things were growing in a particular way. Also, I was showing the way that a particular kind of music perhaps existed without the tension that exists in a lot of the other examples that I chose.
No, it's a fascinating dichotomy, I think. Dylan, of course, we'll come back to you. I'd like to move to Martyn Ware. Martyn, welcome.
Hi.
I wanted to sort of kick off by asking, I think, you know, with today's technology, and as it were, a means of production that is almost zero cost, it's very hard to communicate how revolutionary the arrival of the synthesizer as a, you know, not easily available, but at least available technology was in the 80s. And I just wondered if you could recall what it was like to discover all that amazing machinery that you could make sounds with. Oh, we've got Dylan. Lost Martyn. Okay, I will come back to Martyn when he returns, and if I may, go to Sarah. Sarah, hi. And welcome, of course, again. You have a very sort of significant role in all this, because you are daily curating this music for your listeners, many of whom probably weren't alive when it was being first distributed, I suspect. What are you trying to achieve in your shows on that front? I mean, are you trying to keep it alive? Are you trying to show its relevance to today, or to, you know, reprieve its reputation? What's your kind of goal when you're presenting those shows?
Do you know, I genuinely think that for a lot of absolutely 80s listeners specifically, the 80s were a halcyon decade and remembered as such. I think Dylan used the word explosion, and I think I'd go along with that, a sort of cultural explosion of color and creativity. And in fact, I was talking on my radio show today about, I don't know if you've heard about this Doomsday Vault that's now adding music to it. So many of the songs that Dylan's listed would be in there for me. I mean, I think we couldn't resist Rapper's Delight at the start of this program. It's just, it was this effort to get a rap record into the mainstream, that winning formula of kind of boastful lyrics over a sampled beat. It opened the floodgates for so many rap records to follow, including Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. I think it was one of the first rap songs to use a sample. The beat's taken from Chic's Good Times, which then goes on to become the bass line for, Queen and Another One Bites the Dust. I asked some of my listeners today, what they'd add to this list. And again, echoing the likes of The Specials and Ghost Town, famously written about the decline of Coventry, but really just kind of capturing the mood of the UK at that time. I read very recently that Jerry Drummer wrote that at a time that he knew the Specials were breaking up. So that kind of underlying sense of hopelessness has another meaning to it as well. Blue Monday obviously has to be in there. I mean, famously the best-selling 12-inch single of all time, which is a lovely pub quiz fact to know. One of the first British dance records to kind of cross over to the New York club scene. I know, obviously, we touched on Joy Division. I mean, I've brought my own list with me. I think Love Will Tear Us Apart would have to be in there for me. Just the sound of that kind of decaying industrial north at the time. I'd love to add Bizarre Love Triangle. That's just one of my favorites. I did do a top five, if you're interested to hear them, kind of between me and the listeners.
Love to hear the top five.
Okay, so I'd probably start with Sweet Child of Mine, Guns N' Roses, just the kind of defining 80s stadium rock song by the defining 80s rock band. In fact, Appetite for Destruction.
Start Me Up.
Yeah, and Appetite for Destruction was name-checked today as an album that would absolutely have to go into this Doomsday Vault. I'd put Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer in there, and hear me out on this one, because it's kind of an interesting one.
I wouldn't think so. I think it's a great record.
I remember at university doing a course called Music and the Masses, and it's relevant actually because we talked a lot about how music is such an intensely personal thing. If you insult someone's music choices, that cuts deep, and likewise, if you find someone who has the same musical taste, then instantly there's a bond there. Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer is cited as one of the first times women felt included in rock, which historically up to that point had been fairly misogynistic. You take a song like, I don't know, The Stones, Under My Thumb, and if you listen to the lyrics, they're actually not very pleasant as a woman listening to those lyrics. But Bon Jovi came in with all that swagger of rock, but then this kind of very romantic tale of Tommy and Gina that made it much more appealing, less alienating to women. Is the theory
also, the lyrics
one.
are quite, it's about a fairly bleak kind of flyover state existence, isn't it? Living
right on. Absolutely, but then it's got that 80s feel-good vibe. There you go, it's all going to be all right.
Hold on to what we've got. All right, so we're going well.
Relax is a strong contender for me. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, just this sort of unashamed anthem that shocked so many people at the time, banned by UK radio, but a million seller, kind of showing the tensions between a conservative establishment and this increasingly liberated youth. Simple Minds, Don't You? Because The Breakfast Club and all those John Hughes movies that so many of us grew up watching. That iconic scene where Judd Nelson does the kind of fist pump across the sports field. And then I'd end on Fool's Gold, Stone Roses. Everyone thinks it's a 90s track, but actually it was, late 80s, 89. And it's the launch of Manchester. It's the launch of what was to become known as Britpop. So for me, that's a seminal addition as well. And
links into Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels and a bunch of other films it's appeared in. It's kind of like it's a big hand stretching out of the 80s into the future decades. So I mean, what you've done really is shown how one could actually write, do a whole series of lists of this kind quite legitimately, and that in turn begs a question, Sarah, I guess, which is, what does the 80s have in your view that other decades don't? I mean, what makes it so special?
Because I think it wasn't just about music. Music was a huge part of it. And actually, I think music was so important at that time. You know, you look at the sort of popularity and importance of smash hits at that time, and the music press. I think it had a lot to do with kind of tribes, if I can use that word, that perhaps don't exist certainly as strongly as they did in the 80s. You know, you had the New Romantics, you had the Rude Boys, you had glam metal, sort of denim, leather and spandex. We don't really seem to have those sort of well-defined tribes anymore, or maybe I'm just too old to notice, I don't know. But I think, you know, I think there were those really clearly defined tribes, and when you were a member of that tribe, you felt like you belonged.
Do you think then, I mean, that the 80s was perhaps the last decade where there really was a soundtrack to our lives?
Absolutely, 100%. And, you know, having gone to so many of these 80s rewind festivals over the years, I don't know if you've ever had the pleasure. They're so much fun. They are that kind of explosion of color and neon and
basically my life.
Great. Well, yeah. So, you know, and you speak to some of the acts that play there, and they're well aware that they're the soundtrack to people's lives. You know, I think sometimes there's an element of oversharing when someone will tell Tony Hadley that their child, you know, came out of Spandau Ballet's True or whatever. Like literally the soundtrack to our lives.
Is our youngest daughter muscle bound? The other thing about the 80s that I think sometimes people who didn't live through it find off-putting or surprising was the kind of scale and extravagance. You know, Wham having an album called Make It Big, and Duran's Rio, which I'm honoring with my t-shirt, and Spandau Ballet in gold, that everything had a kind of hyper reality to it. And do you think that's been to its detriment retrospectively, or it's actually part of it? The whole flamboyance is of the essence.
Yeah, definitely. I think the flamboyance is absolutely of the essence. I mean, you know, Dylan mentioned Madonna, who was such an important role model for young women, and the way she just burst on screen, owned that sexuality. You know, young girls couldn't help but feel empowered by that. And it's funny, I was thinking about this earlier, but I think the sort of Top of the Pops appearance where she bared her belly button was so kind of shocking at the time. It seems so kind of tame by today's standards, doesn't it? But yeah, absolutely, the flamboyance and just the sheer fun of it all.
No, I completely agree. It's very easy to forget that it was extraordinary. It was just extraordinary fun. Thank you so much. We'll definitely come back to you. Martyn, are you back online? We lost you for a minute, and I think you're back. Great. Good to see you. Sorry we lost you. Yes. No. What I was trying to ask you was if you can communicate a sense of how amazing it was to get that sudden access to the synth technology that made such an impact on music in the 80s.
Well, I mean, they started in the 70s. We decided to have a pop group that only used synths to create pop music. So it was like a kind of art experiment in the first instance with the Human League. And then when Heaven 17 came along and we started using real instruments as well, we still kept the synthesizers because they'd become ubiquitous by then. And bear in mind the early 80s, before samplers came along. It was kind of the mid-80s when samplers started being used by all and sundry, and that made record production a lot easier. People could actually create arrangements in their bedroom at home and then bring them into the studio and finish them off. So yeah, the synthesizer stuff was very futuristic sounding and very, you know, it was a time of kind of optimism, despite the fact that places like Sheffield were suffering economically at the time and the whole Thatcher thing. But I found it exciting to just challenge myself by making brand new sounds out of nothing, you know, out of your imagination, really. And of course, nowadays, everything's electronic music, pretty much. Everything's processed, and it's hard to delineate between the two. But that's why I think that period the bands that were using predominantly electronic music, like Mark Armand and Soft Cell and many other bands, were really and Erasure and the whole mute thing going on there was really not right at the centre of the mainstream. But I found that much more interesting personally than the rest, than the full-on mainstream stuff.
So when I was going back the other day to early Human League and your time with the band and these amazing tracks like Being Boiled and Sex of Death, where you kind of feel J.G. Ballard might well have been in the studio with you guys. At that time, did you think that this technological revolution was going to lead in a quite art house direction?
I wouldn't categorise what we were doing as art house. We just thought it was, we thought rock and roll was dull and boring.
Yeah.
We thought punk was like punk rock, and we just thought the future was electronic. And in a way, we were right, But rock never died, nor would it ever. And thank God, rap never died, and hip hop and all the other genres. It was just another branch from the tree of pop. But the thing about electronic music at that period is that record companies were willing to take risks on unusual bands at that time.
Yeah.
And there was money flooding in in the post-punk period. People forget that MTV had just launched and all that stuff, but also CDs had launched. So record companies were getting lots more money in, and they had to spend that money or else spend a lot of it on taxes. So they ended up signing, just about anybody who moved. A lot of my friends got signed who I thought would never get signed. People like Cabaret Voltaire and Atletico Spizzetti and, the people who would have been regarded as being outside the mainstream suddenly were getting the chance and being asked to create great records,
And so, but then with Heaven 17, you get, this extraordinary series of just unbelievable killer pop records, from Penthouse and Pavement via Temptation, which I think would figure in a lot of people's top 10 singles ever, certainly mine.
Oh, thank you.
Well, no, definitely. Slam dunk. And then I noticed, I think someone, maybe it was Tessa Murray, my colleague at Tortoise, mentioned Come Live With Me, which is, again, same album, just an extraordinary record. So did you feel at that point, what was the difference? Was there a sense that you were plugging into a more club-oriented zeitgeist, or simply that it was a different project, or what?
No. We when the original Human League split, I was extremely fired up to create something incredibly commercial, and need to give credit to the record company in as much as they gave us pretty much an unlimited budget to make the best record we could, and we were recording at studios at Oxford Street in the most expensive studio in London with big orchestras and the best session players, and thought, right, well, we better seize the day and make the best records we possibly can and go for the pop jugular, which is what we did.
And how, Sarah's mentioned some of her tracks that remain with her. Absolutely. Do you have your own kind of...
Yeah. Here they are. Are you ready?
Of course, yeah.
Okay. I thought it was a very important record because, it's not done so much now, but people could actually feel that they made a difference. And of course, Band-Aid, lest we forget, which I was lucky enough to be involved with. I'm an enormous fan and friend with Vince Clarke from Erasure, so A Little Respect is a fantastic song. Bulletproof. I don't know if anybody's ever been to an Erasure concert, but the whole place explodes as soon as that song comes on. And that relates to, kind of LGBT rights as well. Sign of the Times by Prince.
Yep.
Can't forget that. That is really a central... what can I say? It's the joining point between black culture and white culture, protest, everything. and you know, things like Fight the Power, and of course Biko. You know, I'm a bit of a socialist myself, so I like protest records, and I think we need a few more of them in the charts now. And so I'd be very happy. And of course, Ghost Town, everybody's mentioned that already, and Relax and all that stuff. I've actually got I'm a bit of a plug here. I've got a podcast called Electronically Yours, where I've interviewed most of the people I ever met and worked with in the 80s associated with these things, and it might be worth checking out.
We'll put a link to that in the chat.
Yeah.
Just on the politics, Martyn, while we're talking about it, I mean, one of the charges that was leveled, especially retrospectively, at the big stars of the 80s, was that they didn't engage with the deprivation of the 80s. They were entirely, there was a kind of superficiality to the music. I remember this particularly being leveled at Wham with the second album, and Duran, and what do we have a skewed memory of the 80s, that actually there was quite a lot of protest music, and it wasn't just Red Wedge, actually. It was...
Yeah. Well, if you think about the enormous amount of effort that went into promoting the idea of New Romantics as a kind of brand, and that started really with Spandau and Duran and that following, that kind of in terms of attention overwhelmed the kind of more, should we say, the more credible end of the market at the bottom end. And before you knew it, that was such an enormous force that you had to kind of follow that direction. And sometimes Heaven 17 get lumped in with New Romantics. We had nothing to do with New Romantics. We were more like if you like, the alternative 80s, as it's called now. And I think people tend to forget about the alternative 80s. And we play all those Rewind festivals and stuff. People wearing pink tutus. I'm wearing one right now, actually. You can't see it, but and dressed as a Rubik's cube. That's my favourite one. But it's not really about that. It's people were real music lovers then, and there was and I'd have to argue for the diversity of the ecosystem of music that was on the radio then as well. Now it's all become segmented. I know Absolute Radio does very well, 80s, 90s, whatever, and other commercial stations. But we used to have, national radio stations that used to play a wide variety of music, and that's been very, very severely restricted now and kind of marginalised to a certain extent. And I think it's wrong. I'll give you an example. This is very interesting. Recently, we did, a few years ago, we did a version of Temptation with LaRue. And it was on the BBC Red Button. It was massively popular, and they wanted to put the single out as LaRue versus Heaven 17, and Radio 1 wouldn't play it if it had our name on it. That's where we got to now.
On the grounds that?
On the grounds that we were too old.
Right. That is scandalous.
Yep. And it's real. I'm not exaggerating.
Not that I'm gobsmacked, as my friends will attest, but that is really, really very bad.
Yeah. So you're not going to get anybody over the age of, I don't know, say 30, 35 on Radio 1 anymore. It doesn't matter if they make the most brilliant record of all time. Yeah.
Which is ironic, because if you put Temptation on, it will fill a dance floor anywhere in the world. Best. We will come back to you, Martyn. Thank you very much. I'd like to go to L. Smith. I don't know what the L stands for. Can you let us know?
Leslie.
Leslie, hi, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Very good to see you. Now, you, I thought, with great wisdom, just mentioned Shipbuilding by Elvis Costello.
Yeah, well, actually not by Elvis, recorded by Elvis Costello, but written by Robert Wyatt.
Absolutely, but make the case for that, because I think that's a really good shout.
Oh, it's one of the best songs in the world. It's absolutely brilliant. It tells the story. It's melodic. It's emotionally engaging. It was right on the money for the time, because it was all about the Falklands War. Yeah. So it was it was just massive, and it's a stunningly beautiful song. He still does it. He did it at Blenheim Palace last couple of years ago, and it was just brought the house down. It did make you realise that literally everybody in the audience was the same age. Slightly distressingly.
It's just an incredible record. I just
it's an amazing song.
Just a rumor that's been heard about town. Anyway, and
it's Robert Wyatt, so it's just
it's Robert Wyatt, yeah. So he's Elvis Costello's always been very good at. He's a magpie, as we all know, and Dylan mentioned in his book. Leslie, while we've got you, are there any other that you'd mention as your kind of top 2 or 3?
Well, Ghost Town. I'm dating myself, so I think, and UB40, 1 in 10. I mean, 1 in 10 at the moment it happened was just a terrific song. But I'd also, I mean, those are the kind of protest ones. I mean, I think that, I mean, maybe that is my age, but that time, the was just brilliant.
Yeah.
Soul Mining was a fantastic album, and I think, and it's weird that we've sort of forgotten them. But but the Beat, the Selector, Specials, all that sort of dance music,
very much so,
was, and you still hear it. When I was at university, I had a flat, and the person upstairs, we both had our record players as they were, and only one alarm clock between us. So she used to work in London, so I would put on Mirror in the Bathroom at 7 a.m. so she could be, it would wake her up, and probably everybody else, I guess.
No, these are all absolutely excellent. Thank you. Thanks very much, Leslie. I wonder if I could come to my colleague Tessa Murray, who's been sort of firing a kind of stream of consciousness into the chat, which is quite inspiring. Most recently, Echo and the Bunnymen, just on its own.
Just on its own.
No introduction. For whom, as I recall, Rick in the Young Ones was going to write a letter because he was an anarchist and wouldn't therefore write to his MP. So that in itself justified it. So Tessa, I don't want to even begin to paraphrase some of the thoughts that you've been offering. I think I'm just going to let you rip and tell us what your favourite tracks are and why.
Oh God, Matt, I can't do that because I'll just be here all day.
All right, name 3. How's that?
Oh Jesus. Oh God. No, I can't. All I was going to, I tell you why I can't, because it just struck me. I hadn't really done the maths on it, but I was just saying in the chat, I was 9 at the beginning of the 80s and I was 18 at the end of them.
It's the passage of time. It happened, inevitable, really, isn't it?
I mean, or you could just express incredible shock that I'm that old. But anyway, that's fine, Matt, go with that. And what I'm trying to figure out is if I go back over the span of the last, sort of the 2010 to 2020 period, would my kids look at their generation of music, their growing up music, as it were, and just have, the reason I can't do 3 is because every time I think of something new and it comes up with the chat, I'm like, my God, was it just an incredibly rich decade, or was it just because it was kind of my decade? And then I was just, so that I don't know the answer really. I kind of feel, to Martyn's point about how homogenized music is, even if I take away my personal love and nostalgia for the decade, it has to feel like one of the richest and most varied musical decades, I think.
Yeah.
But if I went up to my 17-year-old's room at the moment and flicked through her vinyl, I tell you what would be at the top of the pile? The Cocteau Twins.
Right. So
what the hell's going on there? Anyway, I'll shut up because I'm loving this. Thank you so much, Sarah, Martyn, Dylan, everyone. It's just a total joy. It's like wallowing in honey.
Exactly. Can we go to, thank you, Tessa. Can we go to Andrew Duran? I don't know if you're there, Andrew.
Hi, yeah.
Andrew, how are you?
Fine, how are you?
Very well. Again, I just wanted to light upon, you mentioned what I think is one of the great singles of the decade. Interestingly enough, Pat Kane is mentioned in our Creative Sense Maker today because he's helping with a new imprint in Scotland. Labour of Love. Go. Why is it so important?
I'm really on the spot there. Yeah, I was on a school trip and I had one of the Now tapes and it was on there, and I remember listening to it and thinking it was a really great song and a really strange beat to it or something. I didn't have the words to describe what I liked about it, but I did love it. And it's been with me ever since I first heard it back then. And it's only more recently that I've gone looking at the lyrics and understanding a bit more about the world as an adult and understanding the Thatcherism and the things that are in there, which makes it even more unusual in terms of being a hit pop record. I just think it's fantastic.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it combines the political with the romantic, which is sort of almost exactly what the whole shooting match was about.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's there's a few songs that kind of stay with you, and you just reach for them whenever you're feeling like you want to put some music on, and that's just one of them for me. You know,
Hue and Cry, Labour of Love.
Yeah.
You know, it was just a classic. Can we go to John now? Who was John? I don't know if you're there.
I am.
Hello, John.
I'm on my phone. I don't know if it's working.
We can hear you, and we can't see you yet, but I will ask anyway, which is, you wanted to throw Fleetwood into the hat, and I'm very interested to hear more about that.
From what I was wondering, from what age are we thought to have lived through a decade? So I was born in the early 80s.
Right.
And so I've lived through the 80s, but musically, I kind of don't remember it. And actually, my experience is music from the 80s feels like it's before my time.
That's
rather
okay.
than from my time.
You can have your 80s whenever you want them, you know, as Sarah's brilliant show. So I think, you know, you don't have to have sort of been contemporaneously alive when the record came out to have a view on it. But I'm interested that you lit upon Fleetwood Mac, and I just wondered, you know, why and what it means to you.
Oh, I love that song. There's just something about it that feels really timeless, and the bit where it starts.
Which song is that? Sorry, John. Which song in particular?
Fleetwood Mac, Everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah, right. Yeah.
And it's just the way it starts is just incredibly uplifting, and I feel like it's not specifically tied to a time. It just feels completely timeless, and I feel like that bit could just be released as a song now. And it always excites me. It always puts me in a good mood. So there's something about that song that's just always grabbed me, and I don't know whether it's from hearing it when I was younger or somehow it's just lived through me as a song that excites me and makes me happy.
And does it give you any sense of connection to that time? Does it sort of evoke something that you were, you know, alive but growing up through? Does it give you a sense of, in the same way as people who listen to Dylan or early Dylan or Simon and Garfunkel will claim that it gives them access to the 60s? You know, does it feel like that?
Weirdly, no, because I think other songs I would have a specific connection or some kind of memory, or there would be something embedded that I would think. So one of the other songs I mentioned, I don't know if it's an 80s song, but David Bowie and Heroes, because of how it reminds me of London 2012 and the Olympics and the emotion of that. So I can really tie that to something specific and the feeling and the experience. But with this song, yeah, weirdly, there's no memory that it ties to, and there's no sense of a time in my life it ties me to.
It's interesting, isn't it, the way it can be free floating. Thanks, John. Can I come to Sarah Hindman now? Sarah, I don't know if you're there.
Hello. Yes, I'm here.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. All right, I didn't expect that.
Good to see you. No, but again, fascinated to see you throwing in a band that I don't think everyone will necessarily remember, but a great band, Bauhaus. Tell us about.
I do not remember them. They would. That's when we started. So I was in my mid-teens, and that's when we started working out how kind of who we were, how we could kind of rebel. And so my memory is being 16, going from a nice girls' school to the local sixth form, being really scared. And I'd drawn the 12-inch cover of the Bauhaus, the latest single, on my bag. And when I walked in, just people made friends with me because they saw the music that connected us all. We all started going to gigs, and they're still my friends today. So they became a really amazing group of people. The other thing I was just writing in the chat is Sue Webster, the artist. She's written a book called I Was a Teenage Banshee. And so she loved Susie and the Banshees, Bauhaus, all of those bands. And that's how she learned about art, because all of them have references to art movements. And so she wanted to know what they were all singing about. She then learned about all of these art movements, and that's directly why she says that she became an artist.
And it's very much to Dylan's point about atomization, isn't it? That there was suddenly this, some people could be goths, some people could be into Bon Jovi. So, there seemed to be room for everything and everyone all of a sudden.
And in the sixth form common room, there were the different groups of people.
Yes, exactly. Located in different parts, slightly suspicious of each other.
And we hid the dodgy records at the back of the record collection.
And of course, still buying records and getting records was a very big deal. Now in the streaming age, we forget that, but the acquisition of a CD or for that vinyl was a big moment in the week or the fortnight.
For me, it's also the visuals. I've lost my connection to music since I no longer see a record cover and go down the playlist. Now it's all kind of just randomly thrown at me without an image. It doesn't make so much sense.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. The loss of music as artifact has been a real shame. Can I thank you so much? Can I come back to Sarah? I just wanted to ask Sarah, about how you as a DJ and as someone people connect to about this, how the 80s is visible in their lives. What sense do you have from the feedback about what it means to them, not just in terms of nostalgia, but actually in their life in 2021?
Yeah, we've kind of touched on this throughout, really, but I think for me, and it is all nostalgia, I'm afraid, but there's nothing quite like music to be able to take you back to a very specific time in your life. One song can bring back such a vivid time for you, as we've just heard. And I do the chart show on a Sunday afternoon where we relive classic hits from 2 golden 80s years, and it can be July 84 and then 89, and the amount of listeners who will say, gosh, this reminds me exactly of being in the common room, or and they can place exactly where they were, to the extent that people will guess exactly what was number 1 in July 84 because they remember exactly where they were and what they were listening to. It's kind of it's quite incredible, really. And I've had to laugh throughout this. It's been so enjoyable. So thank you. Mentioning Hue and Cry earlier.
That was great to have that included. I think.
So one of the questions I've always liked to ask acts and bands at the Rewind festivals is, if you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice in the 80s, just kind of whisper in your own ear, what would that advice be? And Hue and Cry, without a moment's hesitation, said, invest in property, not fast cars. But you know what? I bet they had a great time.
I think they did. I think that well, certainly Pat Kane continues to have a good time, and it's nice to see him. Just one final question, Sarah, is about the whole. You talk about the different months and the specifics. Is it actually a mistake to talk about the 80s almost monolithically? Because one of the lessons I think I picked up from tonight is how unbelievably diverse and the story is it really does through many twists and turns. You could segment the 80s, couldn't you, into lots of things?
Oh gosh, yes. And even I notice this sometimes with the chart show, specifically towards the end of the decade, and the machine that was Stock Aitken and Waterman that took over, and there were so many number ones from them. But lest we forget, also responsible for Dead or Alive, You Spin Me Round, which could be argued as one of the greatest singles of the decade, some might say. So I've got to be really honest, I just cannot abide musical snobbery. I think it's one of the worst. I think if a song lifts you or moves you in some way, that's absolutely the way. And I'm really heartened to hear of teenagers listening to the Cocktail Twins. I think that's a marvelous thing.
Can we come back to Dylan? Dylan, just sort of taking forward the kind of thoughts we've heard tonight. one of the things that occurs to me from your book and the general conversation is that it can't be an accident that Tim Berners-Lee comes along in 1989 and invents the World Wide Web, and something changes. And I know, you wrote about the iPod brilliantly, and I just wonder whether, in terms of sort of video killed the radio star, did the internet change the rules of the game so dramatically that what you describe in the book couldn't have happened in an online era?
Well, I mean, this is like the 90s, the 80s is an analog decade. And I think that musically, the 80s was a bit like the internet before the internet, because there was this massive explosion. But I think it's, to pick up on a couple of things that were said earlier, I think it's very dangerous for anyone to go, my music is better than your music. And I think any person over the age of 20 who criticizes teenagers for their taste in music is on a hiding to nothing.
Yeah.
And I think it's impossible to say that this decade is better than that decade. However, I mean, I had lunch with the head of a record company a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about what works, what doesn't work. And the reason there are no rock bands anymore is because they don't stream. You've got legacy artists who stream, and you've got pop acts and R&B acts that stream. Rock acts don't stream. That's why rock acts don't get signed anymore. And I think that technology has hampered the progression of music in the way that it sort of empowered it and accelerated it. And I think that someone mentioned earlier on that possibly you, that things are kind of streamlined now. So in the 80s, it was atomized, and you had something for everyone, and there was an explosion every 5 minutes or every 3 minutes. And these days, things are in channels, and record companies are far more risk averse. Everything is done by algorithms, and I think that's a very dangerous precedent to set. However, I think it's fantastic to hear the affection with which everybody talks about this particular music. And I think the phrase that I'm going to take away from this evening is something that you said, Matt, whereas you said, we can have our 80s whenever we want. And these days, the 80s, like every other decade, is in heavy rotation. It's a constant cycle, and we can plug into it whenever we want. So perhaps the 80s doesn't need redeeming. It's already been redeemed.
Yes, I think it's within, really. And I think, one of the things about reading your book, which I hope we've been mentioning in the chat, because everyone should order it immediately, is that it made me feel that I can kind of plug into the 80s whenever I want. That it's not a kind of lost wilderness era at all. And actually, the tracks you selected, I mean, I think one of the things about it is impossible to choose 10 tracks, of course. But one of the things about the 10 tracks, whether you think they're the best or not, is that they're all still unbelievably vivid.
Yeah.
And I'm I've already asked you about how you chose it, but in a sense, what I'm trying to is why that's so. Why is it that I mean, Madonna, for example, has reinvented herself with as often as almost any artist other than perhaps Bowie. But that period of Madonna that you describe was different and special. And it's true of a lot of the acts and the singles you select. You've got Pete Smiths, you've got New Order suddenly coming out of the kind of the grey mist of Joy Division to create a Balearic sound that transformed dance music. Was there something in common? What I'm really driving is, was there something in common with all these singles that was peculiar to the 80s?
Well, I think as we discussed earlier, I think media had a lot to do with it. In some respects, pop music was more important in the 80s. There are fewer important pop stars now. There are probably 10 really important global pop stars. Whether that's Kanye or Adele or Dave or whoever, but there are very few of them. In the 80s, there were dozens, probably hundreds. And as I think Martyn mentioned earlier on, I mean, it was a great period for social commentary, a great period for agit pop and the protest song. And I write about Sign of the Times, I write about Ghost Town. These are big records. And also the 80s was responsible for the most successful, most commercially successful, most culturally empowering protest song of all, which was Band-Aid. I mean, it's not a very good record creatively, but its importance is unparalleled. It's extraordinary. Plus, Jerry Dammers, the great genius Jerry Dammers, he wrote Free Nelson Mandela. That wasn't in the 60s. That wasn't in the 70s. That was in the 80s. And you know, Jerry is probably one of our greatest living songwriters, and the amount of material, the amount of important songs that he produced in the 80s is extraordinary. If you just take Ghost Town and you take Free Nelson Mandela, two of the most important pop cultural moments of post-war history.
I mean, to that point, Dylan, it's very interesting that you talk about Live Aid, because, you know, Live Aid was obviously, you know, one of the hinges of the decade, if certainly as far as music and culture generally were concerned, and it reinvented Queen and so on. But it mobilized a huge amount of public opinion. And it's interesting because we've been doing launching a campaign that talks around international vaccines. And the interesting thing is that, as we've seen in the last week, you know, it's arguable that power, that convening power, that mobilizing power has shifted from the world of music into the world of sport. Or to put it another way, that if you were trying to sort out a problem like global vaccination or famine today, you wouldn't necessarily call Bob Geldof and Midge Ure. Fair?
I think that's certainly true. And I think that the atomization has worked in some sense culturally against that idea of convening, because as we know, and as we have discussed ad nauseum, the internet is a great way to bring people together, but it's also a much better way at separating people. And that in our current climate is incredibly dangerous. And I think that I think you're right, but also that feeds into the idea that music is a less powerful convening cultural idea than it once was. And also, I think that pop stars are saying different things these days. I think pop stars tend to be more narcissistic. I think they're talking about themselves. I think that people generally are talking about themselves internally, my problems, my issues, my struggles. People seem to be, they talk less about what's happening in society at large. And as Martyn said, I think it was Martyn said earlier, you know, God, yes, we need more protest songs. Less protest singers, more protest songs.
No, absolutely. Tragically, we have reached the top of the hour. There's so much more I would like to ask and like to discuss, which is always the mark of a good thinking, which has been nothing to do with me and everything to do with you all coming. Thank you so much. And a particular thank you to Sarah, the mighty Martyn Ware, and in particular Dylan, for coming along to discuss this fabulous book. Buy it or be very, very foolish is my parting shot. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Come to the rest of our Think-Ins before we shut down for the summer, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much for coming along, and enjoy the 80s whenever you want.